For decades, France relied on Africa as its economic backbone, extracting wealth while maintaining geopolitical leverage over the continent. However, after revolution, three military leaders come to power in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Things have changed entirely. They brought a watershed moment for France, a major shock that has rattled France and French companies. The expulsion of French troops, corporations, and political influence from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso has shattered France's economic stranglehold over the region. Nowhere is this decline more visible than the financial devastation faced by Air France, which has lost over 65 million euros since being forced out of the Sahel for Air France. The Sahel was more than just another destination. It was a highly profitable monopoly. The airline generated staggering daily revenues, 500 million CFA francs from Mali, 430 million from Niger, and 390 million from Burkina Faso, adding up to over 2 million euros per day. This level of profit was a reflection of just how deeply France depended on the Sahel for economic survival. And we're only talking about one of the hundreds of companies. But with the rise of military-led governments in these nations and their firm rejection of French dominance, Air France was pushed out, cutting off one of its most lucrative revenue streams. The result has been a financial catastrophe, leaving the airline scrambling to regain access to the region. However, the new governments have made it clear that the era of France's unchecked exploits often is over. The revolutionary leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger represent a new era of African governance, one that prioritizes sovereignty over submission. These leaders have taken bold steps to dismantle France's economic and military grip on their countries. That's because they know the reason France has leverage is because of the financial benefits it gets from Africa. If these are stopped, France will no longer have the financial backing that gives it international support. You should know that France has long maintained an image of economic strength and industrial power. But much of its success was built on resources that it did not actually possess. Despite having little to no significant reserves of gold, uranium, and critical minerals, France remained a major exporter of these commodities for decades. These resources were not French. They were African. France extracted them from its former colonies, rebranded them as its own, and profited while African nations remained underdeveloped. One of the biggest examples of this exploitation was gold. France has no major gold mines, yet it exported vast quantities of the precious metal. The source has always been West African nations like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where French companies controlled mining operations under unfair contracts. These deals ensured that African countries received only a small fraction of the wealth generated, while the gold was refined in France and sold as a French commodity on this. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni openly exposed France on live TV now, with Sahel nations reclaiming their resources and kicking out French companies. France's so-called gold exports have all but disappeared, revealing how dependent it was on African wealth. The same pattern applies to uranium, coltan, cobalt, and lithium, essential minerals for modern technology, electric vehicles, and batteries. France does not have significant reserves of these minerals, yet remains an important player in the high-tech industry. But that is changing. Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali's rejection of French influence is not just about political autonomy, but also about dismantling the structural economic dependence that kept Africa subservient to France. This movement gained momentum through a series of military coups that fundamentally altered the power dynamics in the Sahel. The overthrow of pro-French regimes was not merely about local politics, but an outright rejection of France's neo-colonial dominance. Paris reacted with fury, attempting to impose sanctions, severing diplomatic ties, and seeking to isolate the new governments. Yet these actions only accelerated France's downfall in the region. Instead of bowing to external pressure, the new leadership expelled French troops, shut down French embassies, and nationalized key industries that were once controlled by French corporations. Among the most symbolic and financially devastating blows was the removal of Air France, cutting off a major economic artery for France for decades. Air France was more than just an airline. It was a strategic economic weapon, ensuring France's continued control over African air travel. The airline dictated flight routes, monopolized key connections, and extracted wealth from the region while reinvesting little into local economies. Air France maintained a near-total monopoly on flights between the Sahel and Europe, keeping fares artificially high while providing subpar services compared to other international carriers. This system funneled enormous sums of money out of Africa and into French corporate coffers, reinforcing France's economic grip on the region. However, when the revolutionary government seized power, they began to question why Air France was allowed to operate so freely while contributing so little to African nations. When the airline abruptly suspended flights in response to political changes, the Sahel nations responded by banning Air France from returning and exploring alternative partnerships. Mali's foreign minister, Abdoulaye Diop, openly criticized the airline's arrogance and exploitative business practices, exposing how it routinely canceled flights without accountability, stranding African passengers in Europe and elsewhere. He pointed out that such reckless behavior would never be tolerated in the U.S. or other Western nations. Yet Air France felt it could do as it pleased in Africa. That era, he stated, is over. If Air France wants to return, it will stand in line like any other company without privilege or without special treatment. France is no longer in control. Africa is. But if Sahel nations have successfully expelled France and its corporate interests, why is Air France so desperate to return? The answer is economic survival. The loss of the Sahel has been an absolute disaster for France. French corporate dominance was built on the ability to control African markets, ensuring that everything from uranium to air travel remained under French control. With that system now crumbling, France is facing an economic crisis it cannot ignore. Yes, Air France's expulsion is part of a much larger collapse. One of the most severe blows to France has come from Niger, a country that has been the backbone of France's nuclear energy industry for over half a century. Orano, formerly Areva, France's largest nuclear energy company, depended heavily on Nigeria's uranium mines, fueling a power grid that provides over 70% of France's electricity. Before the coup in Niger, the country supplied nearly 35% of France's uranium at exploitative prices. Yet Niger itself received only about 5% of the profits from its uranium sales, while France pocketed the rest. When Niger's new military government came to power in July 2023, they immediately suspended uranium exports to France, saying that Iran plundered the country's wealth while leaving its people in poverty. The consequences for France were immediate and severe. French nuclear plants, heavily reliant on Niger's uranium, were forced to scramble for alternative suppliers from Canada, and Kazakhstan had significantly higher costs that Orano's mining operations in Niger came to a halt, leading to billions of euros in projected losses. More importantly, France lost its cheapest and most reliable uranium source, further increasing its domestic energy costs and threatening its energy security. Meanwhile, Niger has begun renegotiating uranium deals with Russia and China, ensuring that France will never regain its monopoly over Nigeria's uranium reserves. Beyond uranium, the Sahel region is rich in gold, lithium, coltan, and other valuable minerals resources that French companies have historically extracted with minimal compensation to African governments. But with Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso now prioritizing resource nationalism, France's mining industry is collapsing. Gold mining, long dominated by French-backed firms, is now shifting into the hands of new partners. Mali, Africa's third-largest gold producer, has expelled French mining firms and is now working with Russian and Chinese companies. Burkina Faso, which produces over 50 tons of gold annually, has imposed strict regulations on French companies, making continued operations nearly impossible. Niger has also revoked several gold mining permits previously held by French firms, cutting off yet another lucrative revenue stream that once flowed directly to Paris. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. This collapse of French gold mining interests has hit major corporations hard. Endeavour Mining, which has deep French ties and significant operations in Mali and Burkina Faso, is now facing serious restrictions and the potential nationalization of its assets. Baller Group, which previously controlled the logistics and transport of French mining companies in the region, has lost key contracts and is being rapidly replaced by Chinese and Russian logistics firms. With these developments, France's ability to siphon off Africa's gold wealth while keeping local populations in poverty is coming to an end. Another major loss to France's declining economic control in Africa is Total Energies. The country's largest oil and gas company for decades, Total Energies maintained dominance over major oil fields in Chad, Gabon, and parts of West Africa, securing cheap energy resources at the expense of African nations. But as Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso sever their economic ties with France, Total Energies is seeing its once profitable operations crumble to a halt. Niger has frozen oil exports to France and is now prioritizing trade agreements with China. Mali and Burkina Faso have also turned to Russia and Middle Eastern nations for energy partnerships, effectively sidelining Total Energies from the region. Without access to these African energy reserves, France is now increasingly dependent on expensive imports from the Middle East and the United States, a situation it has long wanted to avoid. Furthermore, France's economic woes in Africa extend far beyond natural resources. Infrastructure projects, once a French stronghold, are now being redirected to other international partners. Historically, French companies like Vinci Boutiques and Ice Age controlled the construction of highways, railways, airports, and hydropower dams across West Africa. These projects were typically awarded through corrupt contracts that ensured billions in African taxpayer money flowed into Paris, while local economies remained underdeveloped. However, the new leadership in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger is dismantling the system. French firms are now being replaced by Chinese, Turkish, and Russian companies that offer more equitable partnerships. Local African businesses are also being prioritized over French firms, ensuring that infrastructure investments remain within Africa instead of being siphoned off to Paris. The collapse of Baller Group, which once controlled Africa's largest network of ports, railways, and shipping routes, is one of the most striking examples of this shift, with Sahel nations severing ties with French infrastructure firms. France is losing billions in logistics revenue. This change reflects a broader trend that the days when France dictated the economic policies of its former colonies are over. With its companies being expelled, supply chains cut off, and financial dominance in the region shattered, France is now facing an economic crisis of historic proportions. For decades, the French economy was artificially sustained by Africa's natural wealth without access to cheap uranium from Niger, gold from Mali, oil from Chad, and minerals from Burkina Faso. France is now losing its competitive edge in global energy markets, facing rising costs in nuclear power production, struggling to maintain its trade dominance in West Africa, and watching once powerful French corporations crumble. What truly alarms France, however, is the growing realization that the Sahel rejection of French influence may inspire the rest of Africa to follow suit. Already, anti-French sentiment is growing in other former colonies, such as Senegal, Chad, and Cameroon, where governments are beginning to reconsider their economic dependence on France. Even Ivory Coast and Gabon, long seen as loyal French allies, are witnessing an increase in political movements calling for the end of French economic domination. Meanwhile, BRICS nations are gaining more influence across Africa, offering trade and development deals that present an alternative to France's historically exploitative arrangements. If this trend continues, France risks losing all remaining strongholds in Africa, permanently cutting off the wealth that has sustained it for over a century. The economic downfall of France and Africa is not just about business losses, that it is the collapse of an entire system of neo-colonial exploitation. The days when African wealth flowed into French banks while Africans remained in poverty are over. The Sahel nations have made it clear France is no longer welcome to exploit their resources. Paris is now experiencing what former French President Jacques Chirac once warned about. Without Africa, France is nothing, but with each passing day, Africa is proving that it does not need France to thrive. At the heart of this crisis is the end of France's economic model in Africa, a model based on extraction control and minimal reinvestment into African economies without Africa's resources. France is now struggling to maintain its position as a global economic power. However, interestingly, France wants Air France to return, and this push is not just about an airline. It is a strategic test. If France can force its way back in through Air France, it could open the door for other French corporations to follow. It could create the pretext for French diplomatic and even military re-engagement under the guise of economic cooperation. However, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso see through this maneuver. The leadership of these countries has made it clear that France will not be allowed to re-enter through the back door. The idea that Africa cannot function without France has been thoroughly debunked. In reality, it is France that cannot function without Africa. This revolution is not just about expelling one airline. It is about dismantling the entire economic system that France built to keep Africa under its thumb. The French government is now experiencing firsthand what happens when a country built on exploiting Africa suddenly loses its grip. The world is witnessing the rise of a new Africa that demands fair partnerships, respect, and economic justice. France, once the master of the Sahel, is now learning that without Africa's resources, it is no long.